Hello and welcome back to the Beyond Phenomenal podcast. My name is Bryce Bicknell, and I'm excited to get into this week's episode. There have been a lot of developments. Just a reminder that this podcast was started to address a very common complaint that I've seen in the UAP field, and that there's too much hype and there's not enough news. So I want to keep it tight for everyone and just give you guys a quick update on what's been going on, and then I'll get into my commentary and some of the bigger picture stuff at the end. And I'll also try and provide a little context for each story for those of us who haven't been immersed in this field. I want to make this approachable for everyone. And with that said, let's get into the news. So last week I talked about the Mosul Orb with Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp, and they released their new podcast called Weaponized. But this week they released a second episode that really blew open a story. The general name, if you look it up, it's the 2019 USS Omaha incident. There was kind of what they called a drone swarm is what kind of the media called it. But there was a lot, and I want to slowly unpack this for everybody. So there were 10 Navy ships that were doing some training exercises about 100 miles off of the coast of California. And there were personnel who tried to intercept the UAP. They said that they would see them over a span of a few different days, usually going into the late night. And when they tried to intercept the UAP, they found that they would evade them by going into the water or flying above their flight altitude. These were... Yeah, I mean, they call them drones. They behaved in a similar way to drones, but clearly we're going to talk about some of the stuff that came out of the Weaponized podcast. There were some things that really were confusing about this whole incident that don't add up to the official narrative. Or I wouldn't want to say it's an official narrative, because the official narrative is actually that they're unknown. So one of the things that was brought up was an unclassified slide in a military briefing that I believe Jeremy or George were able to recover, and it said that there were attempts to find the wreckage in the water. So I talked about how some of these UAP that were swarming these ships, I believe it was, there were over 100 total UAP surrounding these 10 different naval ships in this training area, and when they would see, there's video that they have too, if you want to look it up on their website. It goes into the water, and then they attempted to find the wreckage, but it was unsuccessful according to that unclassified slide. And there were also anti-drone, so it's a common thing. A lot of military people are reporting that they'll see drones at increased rates, and now they have anti-drone systems. They have kind of weapon systems that are used to take them down. And there were two or three, I believe, that Jeremy mentioned. And also he had a guest speaker on. I believe his name was John Gutierrez, something like that. You can find the podcast. But they were ineffective against these UAP. They tested them later against traditional technology, drone technology, and it worked like a charm. So it's kind of confusing. The narrative of just drones is falling away. There were more witnesses that they found who were willing to talk about what they had seen. There were at least, I want to say, a dozen, and they had different forms of corroborative evidence, like infrared footage. They had regular video that was filmed on top of the deck of one of the ships, and they also had radar returns of at least 14 UAP. That was on just one of those ships. And some Navy witnesses said that the performance of these UAP were unusual and advanced, that weren't indicative of drones. And the Pentagon also confirmed various evidence released by George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell, because in some cases they didn't even have this information. It kind of leaked out. Leak kind of gets a bad name, but it was given to them. But because of the way the reporting is a little bit stagnated, or it's not cohesive, the Pentagon didn't necessarily have all of the information. So that's just one aspect of the story. Another part of the story I wanted to get into was another ship called the USS Russell that was also there during the timeline of the Omaha incident. But they had 3 pyramid-shaped UAP that were tailing their ship. I think only about 700 feet away was about as close as they got. There was a lot of talk about, is this triangle-shaped? Is it pyramid-shaped? It was that classic green video that you might have seen from I think some kind of night vision goggles that was filmed. But they really didn't want to, in the podcast, they didn't want to even get into the pyramid shape, because at the end of the day, this is what some of them said. They stopped their ship the USS Russell, the Navy ship, and the UAP would also stop. They'd start it again, and they would be tailing them. And the same three anti-drone technology weapon systems were used against these UAP, but they were also ineffective. And in particular, one witness that Jeremy Corbell got to talk with directly said I think it, quote, zoomed upwards without making any noise or having any detectable signatures like exhaust or something that you would traditionally expect in a drone. Another interesting part of this story was another witness. There are a lot of witnesses that were coming out in this whole 2019 Omaha incident, and they said that they saw one of the UAPs shine a spotlight for a few seconds onto the bridge of the Navy ship, and it was super bright. In fact, he said he was surprised by how luminous it was given the distance. And I just wanted to consider that the power required is absolutely incredible. This is unlike, this is according to the witnesses too, it's just unlike anything that they're used to dealing with. I know just recently there was a lot of talk about this Chinese spy balloon that was seen over Montana. And it's, if you look at that photo, it's super obvious. You're like, okay, I can see it. It looks like a balloon. You see these kind of natural pieces of tech that might be, I don't know, cameras or whatever, sensors or something. That's not that crazy. But what they're seeing here is textbook definition unidentified. Strange things like big spotlight being cast down just for a couple seconds. They're out there for hours at a time. I'm going to talk about some of the other characteristics that make this just such a crazy case. But let me talk about the way that the narrative was kind of construed, because they got into this on the podcast and I thought it was fantastic. The New York Post had an article that claimed that the swarm of ships, the swarm around the ships had been solved, that they were drones, and that they were coming from, I think, a commercial ship called the Bass Strait. But the myth even spread as far as Wikipedia, because then, you'll take these sources. All it takes is someone to say, well, it's solved, and then references will be made, on Wikipedia and through other news agencies. And then it kind of spreads this misinformation, really. It's pretty patently false, too, because another witness, this is crazy. It's just the amount of witnesses that came out, not fully, we don't know their names, but who are willing to speak directly to Jeremy Corbell was really incredible. What he said is the sailor who was in charge of watching the Bass Strait, where the vessel or the drones allegedly landed on or took off, he said that even though they were looking, they thought they had identified this as the source, and they were hoping to figure it out because we all want to know, right? It's a mystery, so we're all interested in figuring it out. But he said they never saw any of these UAP land or take off from the ship. And here's something that just really shows that this narrative is just completely wrong. Even when the Bass Strait was in port, there were still encounters with these UAPs. So it's completely false that they could be launching off of this ship. And there was more evidence now after all of these witnesses came out that was publicly available, or that's publicly available now, than there was before. And it just changes how we can interpret this story, because we heard about this a couple years ago, I believe, maybe a year or two when they first released some of the initial video, and there was a lot of fanfare, but very quickly debunkers took it and sort of cast it aside. And I think now we've got some more meat on these bones. And now it's going to take a little bit more to... It's going to be more rigorous to really pull this thing apart and just say, well, it was this, well, it was that. I just got a couple other notes left over from this. All of this happened over multiple nights, and I believe, some of the earliest times that it would happen was like 11 p.m. might have been some of the earliest times. Usually it's like 3 a.m., 2 a.m., midnight, very late hours, which is unusual for... In fact, it doesn't really happen because of the training exercises, that they would never test this theory that this could have been some test on U.S. Navy personnel by the U.S. It just falls apart because they never test this late, according to the witnesses. And they were already doing trainings during the day, so it would be very unusual. Another witness who talked to Jeremy said that they saw adversarial and friendly drones in that same time period while they were out there, but they still had no idea about these UAP and how they even performed the maneuvers that they saw, like an instant stop and hover. For reference, even some really good drones, the high technology drones that we have now, performing things like an instant stop, usually there's a little bit of a wavering, right? It kind of violates how traditional propulsion systems would work, that you could just immediately stop, and not only that, no noise. So that's a real lingering question. And then the UAP were also seen on radar coming in from the west, which was the open ocean, and they were also dispersing in different directions from where they came, which if you're flying a drone, you would have it returned to you from its original location. And this is tens of miles off the coast. And if they're coming from the west, there's not land for, I think the witness said, Hawaii would be the closest thing. I mean, that's true. You can just look it up on a map. So the photos and videos don't capture the whole story that we see right now. Those photos and videos that we have, it's not the whole story. You can't dismiss the testimony and some of the other data that has now come in, and it really paints an entirely different picture. I'm excited to just see what the reaction from Congress and the public will be on this, especially when I saw how much attention this Chinese spy balloon got. I think it's allegedly a spy balloon, but there's an interesting mismatch on, we have some photos of that, and everyone's acting like, oh my God, this is crazy. We need to do something about this, or, should we shoot it down? Should we not? But it's not even that interesting. This is an entirely new thing that, in terms of if you're worried about China or you're worried about any other of these adversaries potentially, this is game changing. So the fact that it's not being talked about by by the mainstream media and other people, I find really interesting. But I'll move on to another topic, because I know that was a big information dump, but it's really worth watching that podcast if you want to hear the direct testimony. But I'm just giving you the big highlights, some of the big things like the spotlights, where they were coming from, the fact that they used anti-drone tech, no noise, a lot of different weird things I just wanted to throw at you all at once. But yeah, it's worth listening to that podcast. It is a bit long. It's over 2 hours, but those are the highlights. All right, so the next thing I want to get into is the 2022 lame duck report. That was a follow-up, sort of, to the 2021 preliminary assessment on UAP. Ultimately, the 2022 report took until this year to come out, and a lot of people were underwhelmed by it. But something that was important, some of the main takeaways, that there are a lot more cases, and that they're going to try and work together with a lot of different agencies and branches of the military to get better reporting, and to study these things. And I don't really want to get into the report that much, because there was so much jargon. That was pretty much it. They just said there were more reports, their stuff is unidentified. It was almost like a walk back, I think is probably what Ross Coulthart said. From the 2021 report, it was very watered down. It's almost like someone was trying to make it boring. But the slideshow that Sean Kirkpatrick put out, that was about AARO, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. For context, that's the new office that's come out of the legislation that passed for this year. I wanted to highlight one specific quote about something that they're looking at in an AARO. Quote, any physiological, psychological, or other effects associated with the UAP observation. And I think someone on Reddit, I think it was Tiny Claus, pointed out a connection that could be interesting that Lou Elizondo talked about in an interview with GQ. And I'll read this quote too. Quote, the proposed new UAP office would have to report on health-related effects for individuals who have experienced UAPs. What kind of thing might happen if you were near one? This is GQ, I think their interviewer asking Lou, and then this is a response. Quote, a lot. Let me give you a notional. I've got to be careful, I can't speak too specifically, but one might imagine that you get a report from a pilot who says, Lou, it's really weird. I was flying and I got close to this thing and I came back home and it was like I got a sunburn. I was red for 4 days. Well, that's a sign of radiation. That's not a sunburn, it's a radiation burn. Then a pilot might say, if they had gotten a little closer, Lou, I'm at the hospital. I've got symptoms that are indicative of microwave damage, meaning internal injuries, and even in my brain, there's some morphology there. And then you might get someone who gets really close and says, you know, Lou, it's really bizarre. It felt like I was there only for 5 minutes, but when I looked at my watch, 30 minutes went by, but I only used 5 minutes worth of fuel. How is that possible? Well, there's a reason for that, we believe, and it probably has to do with warping of space-time. And the closer you get to one of these vehicles, the more you may begin to experience space-time relative to the vehicle and the environment. Wow. When I first heard that quote, I think this was probably over a year ago. It might have been in like 2021. This was one of the things that kind of blew my mind that Lou Elizondo has said, because if they're really, I know it's a notional, but if they're really experiencing this, like if someone has come up to I guess ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, that's what the program that Lou Elizondo ran. If pilots were coming and saying that is game changing in and of itself. That you don't necessarily need to see a flying saucer being rolled out in front of the White House. That's already fantastic. And then another aspect I kind of wanted to bring into this to give a little bit more context was from Christopher Mellon. Again, he was a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence under, I believe, the Clinton and George H.W. Bush presidency. And he made a comment on his website, or I think it was through an article on the Debrief about the 2021 report. So not this past year's report, but the preliminary assessment that should give a little bit more perspective. And I'll just read it here. Quote, "It is my understanding that the U.S. Air Force contributed very few, if any, of the 144 reports to the 2021 preliminary assessment on UAP. If one or two U.S. Air Force UAP reports did slip through, they are at best the exception that proves the rule. Otherwise, it was virtually all U.S. Navy reporting." So that's curious. You can also tie it back to the fact that we're hearing about the USS Omaha incident, and we're not necessarily hearing about Air Force incidents. That was a big thing. We're hearing lots of witnesses, but the Air Force seems to be really tight-lipped about this whole subject. And I wanted to go back even more and point out that Air Force were some of the people in the Air Force wanted to close down Project Blue Book and recommended against the NASA UFO office under President Carter. We talked about that last week when they were getting a ton of mail and they didn't know what to do. And so I think the science advisor, Frank Press, tried to get NASA to open up a new UFO office, which is what they called them at the time. But the Air Force and the CIA had recommended, you really shouldn't, we hope that you don't do this. And the Air Force also had a role in, they were helping to run Project Blue Book, but they shut it down ultimately. So there's kind of a glaring discrepancy when you look at what the U.S. Air Force has access to in terms of their sensor systems and their duty to protect our airspace, but there's this lack of reporting by them that I think is incredibly conspicuous, and Chris Mellon also pointed this out in his article. He continued to talk about the different sensor systems. One that's very impressive is called the Space Fence, and that tracks 25,000 or I think and more objects in orbit. Allegedly, some are about as small as a marble, which when you think about that, there should be something. We should be seeing things like that. I know, I think Chris Mellon pointed to something about the National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO, maybe NORAD, all these different people that are in charge of viewing our airspace and the area around in our orbit. We should be seeing things. There's also the Solid State Phased Array radar system, which is designed to track ICBMs and other missiles around North America. And these would pick up on things like a UAP because, they're going to be around the same size as a missile, roughly. These are just the sensor systems that are public, but I also have no doubt that they have some crazy systems at the classified level. I know I'm going to bring up something else that's relevant to what I'm talking about. In the the open congressional hearing that we heard on UAP recently within the last, I think it was 2022 that we had this hearing. They were, I think it was Scott Bray and Moultrie. I forget their names exactly, but they were kind of pressed on these sensor systems. And one of the things they pointed to were these sensor systems that they have underwater in the ocean. And they referred the members of Congress to the classified section. They told them to ask those questions during the classified part of that briefing, which I thought was really interesting. So we probably know a hell of a lot more than what we just hear from, Navy witnesses and radar operators. And so I find it really dubious that the Air Force doesn't know more about this. I mean, it's in their kind of charter to protect our airspace, and yet they're also one of the quietest branches of the military on this whole UAP issue. And so that's something I wanted to touch on as well. And now I want to get into something that when I first read, it felt like a bombshell. These are the Eric Davis and Admiral Wilson notes. These are very controversial, but very explosive. We've had some incredible comments come from a variety of the key players in this area. And let me just highlight the notes, what they say at a high level for people who might not know. These are notes from a brilliant physicist known as Eric Davis, Dr. Eric Davis, who works now, I believe, for Aerospace Corporation, which is a defense contractor. And allegedly, he took these notes while talking to Rear Admiral Tom Wilson, who at the time was, I believe, the deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, so that's second in command, and then he went on to be promoted to director of the DIA. And the notes basically detail Admiral Wilson's failure. I mean, he attempted to find, quote, the program, basically, where they have these crash wreckage saucers and alien technology, basically, and perhaps even bodies. I don't believe bodies are really mentioned in the notes, but basically the holy grail that I was talking about last episode. And he said ultimately he reviewed all of these black budget programs that are called special access programs, and there's an oversight committee for them, and he talked to some of the people and found, records within a different record group in these special, subset of the special access programs. And when he got to them, he called them the, quote, gatekeepers. It was like the program director, an NSA kind of like intelligence guy, and then I think a legal expert. There were three people, and they called themselves the watch committee or the gatekeepers. And they basically said, yeah, we have non-human technology, we have alien technology, not made on this earth, not made by human hands, something like that. Kind of just laid it out for him, but they didn't show him anything, and they shut the door in his face. They said, you don't have a need to know. And then Admiral Wilson tried to complain about this to the other people, and he also got his the door slammed in his face. And so that's kind of what the notes cover, and it gives you some interesting details. But I want to talk about, that's a bombshell. That is absolutely a bombshell. And we've gotten to the point where I think most researchers in ufologists would say that beyond a shadow of a doubt, these notes were genuinely written by Eric Davis, and they probably detail a real series of events. Now, there are a lot of people, skeptical people, that would say no, hold on, they just have doubts about it, and it's fine to have doubts. But I also think it's interesting to talk about the chronology, because a lot of the chronology works out pretty perfectly when you look at how these notes weren't supposed to be public initially, but they came out of Dr. Edgar Mitchell, I believe he was an Apollo 14 astronaut, his estate after he died, and then someone who's close with the family, they were going to get rid of a bunch of his documents, but some guy, I think who's still anonymous, kind of stepped in and contacted James Rigney, who I think that's his name, who was an Australian researcher, I believe, and he saw the notes, and so he had those in his possession, and eventually he shared them with Grant Cameron and then with other people. I believe even Richard Dolan had seen a few pages of this, of Eric Davis's notes back in 2000, perhaps even 2001 or two, and no, I'm getting that wrong, because the conversation that allegedly occurred between Eric Davis and Tom Wilson happened, I want to say, in 2002 in a car parking lot in EG&G in Las Vegas. So, I mean, that's kind of crazy, because here's another tie-in. EG&G was, I believe, the company that did staffing for Area 51. So a lot of strange connections. And I just love everything about this, the mystery of it, how clandestine it is, but also we've been getting crazy statements. So recently, I know I've been talking a lot about Chris Mellon, but it's because he's such a heavy hitter. You know, he was at about, I think, the third highest level in the Department of Defense. And on his website, he also, in an aside, in a sentence, he kind of casually admitted this. He's like, something, Eric Davis, the author of the Wilson Davis notes, He admitted that was true, which is crazy, because he probably, you know, I have no doubt that he's probably gotten that real confirmation. I believe Gary Nolan also admitted that, you know, Eric Davis was the author, and I know, I think in his interviews he's mentioned that he knows Eric personally. And there are other aspects of the notes too that add to their validity. For example, Oak Shannon is another physicist, I think, who worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and he had an interview with Project Unity, another great podcast. You know, I get my information from podcasts too, but, you know, I try and pull everything together. These podcasts are really great. I can't recommend them enough. But Oak Shannon pretty much confirmed everything that was, I think genuinely everything that was said about him in the notes. It's true. The only strange point of, I guess, discrepancy is the fact that Admiral Wilson categorically denied that he knew Oak Shannon. But Oak Shannon said, I mean, hey, I knew, basically, I'm paraphrasing, I knew him, we interacted a little bit, but I'm a forgettable guy, so, you know, he was giving him the benefit of the doubt. But it doesn't add up. You know, it really doesn't add up, because Tom Wilson also has to deny anything about this, because of the level of security that that the notes are, the programs that the notes are discussing. It's so sensitive that he has to, from what I understand legally. And then, of course, Eric Davis himself has always been, I can't comment about that. He was pressed really hard by, I think, Stephen Greenstreet. You know, did you write it? Can't talk about that. You know, is what said about it, is it true? I can't talk about it. How did it come out? Well, it came out of Edgar Mitchell's estate, is what he said. Eric Davis said that. But he's like, I can't talk about anything else. So he confirmed the backstory. But here's where the news comes in. This is another angle that I think is really interesting, and this comes from Jacques Vallee, who I'll just take a quick little break to talk about him. So, in the role of Jacques Vallee, kind of adding credibility to the Wilson Davis notes, let's talk about him. Jacques Vallee, most famously, I think, in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he was the reference for the French scientist in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Jacques Vallee was part of the program, I think, that originally worked to build ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet. And he's been releasing books for decades. This guy is top notch in terms of ufology. You know, you can almost consider him like the father of ufology at this point, just because he's been in the game for so long, and he has, you know, so much information and so much credibility. And he released a new version of Forbidden Science, which is this kind of series he's doing, which document, I think, his kind of notes over the years. I really want to read this. I haven't had the time to get through it. But the Hermetic Penetrator, I know that, once again, a lot of names, but this is another player, an important player, who released with Omega Point the phenomenal research paper, could be a book, called Loose Threads. I was thinking about talking about Loose Threads this episode, but I think it's way too down in the weeds, and it would take too long. So let's focus on Forbidden Science Volume 5, which covers 2000 to 2009, from Jacques Vallee. So I'm going to read a bunch of different quotes from Jacques Vallee's book in excerpts that were pulled out in a Twitter thread by the Hermetic Penetrator, and I'll list a link to that thread in the outline of this video. But it's going to be rapid fire. There are going to be a lot of names and players, and then I'll try and kind of reel it in and tell the general story. I'll probably weave in some of my thoughts during these quotes. But October 3rd, 2003. Quote, confused, I went over some of the chronology again, I being Jacques Vallee. Evidently, the program was inside the government at some point. Under Nixon, it got transferred to a private contractor in order to secure it. Next quote. 2nd of October 2003. This was on the 1997 meeting. This was also referenced in the Eric Davis, Admiral Wilson notes. Quote, Wilson was unimpressed by Greer, and he was upset at the meeting with Miller, who, quote, sounded flaky. But he was reportedly influenced by Oak Shannon, and agreed to look into the existence of a possible secret project involving UFO hardware. Another interesting quote, right? 2nd of October 2003. William Perry, Secretary of Defense at the time, authorized his review of black projects, and Wilson did find a multi-billion-dollar discrepancy that he tracked down, as General Jack Sheehan had done a few years before. Also really crazy. Same date. Quote, Tom Wilson went to the Special Access Program Oversight Committee and raised hell. He was, quote, livid at the lack of oversight. He told his interviewer, Eric Davis, so I'm just gonna stop it right there. This is still within the quote. He told his interviewer, Eric Davis, that he's probably referring directly to the notes or to another conversation he's had with Eric Davis. This is pretty crazy. So he's just another player who's also, I guess, keeping this document alive and well, very alive and well. And I'll continue. But he was told that if he didn't drop it, he'd lose 2 stars and would never be director of DIA. Wilson dropped it, but he remained mad. This is right out of the notes. So that's another point of corroboration. And I know some people might say, well, it's, how is that corroboration? I mean, Jacques Vallee's work is impeccable. I'll keep reading some of the other quotes. This is on the same 1997 Admiral Wilson's meeting with Greer, Miller, and Mitchell. I believe there's a letter that is attached to the 15-page document of the Eric Wilson Davis notes. I probably butchered the name, but quote, a few weeks later, Miller received a cryptic call from the Admiral's office saying only, "You are correct." So, wow. Let's keep going. 2004, September 24th. Quote, Charles Bowsher, Bowsher, if you're curious, uncovered a bizarre SAP, Special Access Program, cover-up which surely violated every classification, executive order, regulation, and congressional rule. They contemplated turning it over to justice for prosecution, but a powerful person in the Department of Defense quenched it. Wow. Same date, quote, Jim Westwood uncovered a third official trail into the secret UFO project through Charles Bowsher, Comptroller General of the United States under President Reagan from 1981 to 1996. He may be one of the 4 iron posts beyond Sheehan and Wilson. So, there's kind of a building story. I guess these 4 iron posts perhaps are the people who know, I guess, who are outsiders but discovered these programs. And I guess it's Jim Westwood, W-E-S-T-O-O-D, Jim Westwood. And then the General Jack Sheehan, and I believe Admiral Wilson. And let's see, I think I've got one or two more. So the 18th of September 2003, he, General Sheehan, also said he would honor his secrecy oath and not reveal more, but he did acknowledge he found a $9 billion discrepancy in some budgets which led him to uncover the project. So I'm just got to stop because $9 billion, I think last podcast I might have said, this could be hundreds of millions of dollars, but if this is true, $9 billion, I know it's probably not all of the $9 billion, but this could be a real ugly thing. And I knew Lou Elizondo, I know he in the past has talked about UFO amnesty, and this could be the angle that he's getting at. Because if billions of dollars are at stake here, no doubt there are going to be people who might get, focus on the prosecution, let's go out for blood. But I understand the nature of how difficult this stuff can be, so I'll start to move into my general big picture stuff. So that's about all I have in terms of the hard new developments. But yeah, I'll get into my commentary. Whew, okay, so we covered a lot of different things just in this episode. It's kind of, I know, a big information dump, and that's one of the downsides, I think, of this podcast. But I like to slow it down a little bit and get into the big picture, because I think when you just get focused on the nitty-gritty stuff, you can lose sight of, well, wow, what can this really mean for all of our lives? And the angle I wanted to talk about is kind of a few different things. But how our society has really been shaped by the UFO story in the post-World War II era. So if the whole UFO story is true, well, what would have happened if we had been honest and open about our discoveries? These crash retrievals that seem to be leaking out, and I'm talking about the stuff from Jacques Vallee, where he's kind of confirming this overall narrative that we're hearing now. If that's true, think about it. 9/11 would have happened all the while these programs are being kept secret. The war in Iraq, all of the war against terrorism, the Gulf War, the Vietnam War, I believe the Korean War, all of these millions of lives lost without this perspective that could potentially, in my opinion, unify humanity. It could really bring us together in a way that I think nothing else could. It would be very humbling. But also, if it's false, why have there been so many high-ranking officials and military personnel who have been lied to or deceived, or why have they perpetuated this lie? And that is totally disregarding even all of the civilians and normal, everyday citizens who see UFOs or UAP. Have we all been tricked? Have we all been deceived? I don't really like thinking this way, because I think it's just so complex and irrational. You kind of have to subscribe to Occam's razor sometimes. I know it makes life easier for me. And even if it's true, hell, it's crazy and it's hard to understand. And I think we've seen this firsthand. But also, if it's false, it's even weirder. It's even more out there. What on earth could be going on that would constitute this level of I guess just cognitive dissonance, strange behavior of people, strange psychology. Anyway, I don't even want to get into that, but it's just weird. And I love the fact that because it's so strange, this mystery is, I think, the most appealing thing for me personally. There's nothing else I love talking more about it, because there's so much. There's so much to it, and every outcome is fantastic. And then I also want to just drop a list. I have a list of names of this is a short list of Congress members who have supported this UFO field, UFO research. The late Senator Harry Reid, he was tied to the whole ATIP and OSAP story. These are programs, I've talked about their acronyms before, but if you're curious, you can find in the 2017 New York Times articles, Senator Harry Reid did a whole lot for just to get all of this stuff moving, to even get the conversation where it is today. Without him, I probably wouldn't even be talking right now about this. There's also Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Congressman Ruben Gallego, who I think they're responsible for some of the new amendments for really pushing this into the National Defense Authorization Act. And Congressman Mike Gallagher, he was the one who got the EWD notes into the congressional record. There's another Congressman, Tim Burchett, he's open about it. He thinks there's a cover-up. He said it multiple times. He doesn't believe what's been going on. He thinks it's kind of a dog and pony show. There are also all 16 of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence members who agreed unanimously to create this new UAP office and these whistleblower provisions. And then a historical senator, Barry Goldwater, whose story, just kind of like Harry Reid's, it's worth an entire episode on its own. There's a ton of history that is really well broken down. Honestly, in terms of UFO history, Richard Dolan is my go-to guy, just because he's covered it so methodically in his books. And I would love to, if I had the time to, I would probably go through and reread everything. I only got through about half of his second book. I think it's called The Cover-Up Exposed. But if all these important people are taking this issue so seriously, I wonder why we aren't doing the same. I mean, I know if you're listening to this podcast, you care about that. It's what motivated me to do this. But there's such a strange discrepancy because, like I said, all the wars that have been fought, and that doesn't even cover this other angle about, the discoveries that could be, kind of free energy, new propulsion systems that, and energy systems that could radically change the way that we, generate carbon, and change our climate and use our resources in the world. It seems that we've been doing this so unsustainably, and I think if you want to focus your effort on something that could dramatically change the path of our civilization towards something more sustainable, I think this is it. But unfortunately, there's a lot of stigma and a lot of bad information, and I wouldn't say necessarily like the most good faith actors in this arena. That kind of comes with the territory, But let me give an interesting personal example too that's kind of colored my opinion about how all of this works. My HR professor, I'm taking a human resource management class. He talked about his experience getting hired, I think for it was a lower level position. I'm pretty sure it's not like he, his dad was in the military, but it wasn't like he was, totally enlisted. But he was going to get a job with the NSA, and it was out of like a scene in the movie. They hooked him up to a polygraph test at the machine, like in a dark room. They had the single dangling light, and he said there was a burly guy who was barking questions at him about his background, and he failed it. And it's laughable. Let me give you a little bit of context. It's illegal to use a polygraph test for employment in any other circumstance except for government jobs like these. Because it's so unlike how the rest of the world operates. It's kind of funny. Why is this culture still here? This kind of like, who do you work for? It's almost like a Hollywood thing. But this is still kind of what goes on within certain intelligence and military communities. I just wonder why. I mean, in our class we learned that polygraph tests, they don't even work well. There's a reason why they're illegal to use. And in fact, they coached my professor, the NSA. I think people who were trying to hire him, they're like, oh, that happens quite a lot. And they taught him how to pass it, and he passed it. So what's the point of even doing it? It almost reminds me of like a fraternity hazing ritual. I mean, I get exposed to that kind of stuff because, I'm not in a frat, but I live in a college town. And so I kind of see these like cultural things as like an initiation, and it probably stifles some of the reporting, the whistleblowing, and it protects the national security secrets, almost like it's a cult of national security. But yeah, it's just different from what a lot of people are used to in a hiring process. He had to fly out to, I think, somewhere in Washington, D.C. or something like that to take this polygraph test, and it's just so comical to me. And yeah, that's all I've got for this week. I mean, there was a lot more stuff I wanted to talk about, but I can't fit it in. I don't want to go up to an hour, so I'm just going to cut it off here, and I would love to hear more of your guys' feedback. Thank you so much for listening. Once again, my name is Bryce Bicknell, and this has been Beyond Phenomenal.